Welcome to Practical AI in Healthcare, the podcast that cuts through the noise to spotlight real-world solutions delivering real-world value. From patient care to clinical research, from life sciences to patient engagement, we focus on what truly matters in healthcare today. No hype, no theory, just practical insights where AI is making a true impact. Dr. Stephen Lapkoff and Dr. Leanne Rosenblit are your hosts as we explore what's real and moving the needle in this exciting new domain. Welcome aboard and let's get to it. Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Practical AI in Healthcare. We have a treat today. We have with us a gentleman who is one of my former professors way back in my informatics fellowship. And before I introduce him, I want to just say that this will be a recording with my partner, Dr. Leanne Rosenblit, and we'll be handing off questions back and forth. And I'd like to introduce everyone on the podcast to John Glaser. John, aside from being my former professor back 30 plus years ago, is an executive in residence at Harvard Medical School. He's the former senior vice president of population health at Cerner, chief executive officer at Siemens Health Services, and a long line of all kinds of accolades. And most recently was named board chair at the Scottsdale Institute. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome John to the podcast today. And it's a reunion of sorts because I haven't really worked with him in a very long time. So, John, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Pleasure, Steve. Good to see you again, as always. And Leon, I'm delighted to have you join the conversation.
So, John, let's give the audience who isn't as familiar with your background just a little more detail on where you've been, what you've done. I mean, you were the CIO at Partners Healthcare. I mean, all kinds of different moves throughout your career. Maybe you could just give us a little background.
Yeah, see, fair enough. I was an undergraduate degree in math from Duke way long time ago. I got out there, did not know what to do with myself, so I hitchhiked from Fairbanks, Alaska to the Panama Canal through North Carolina. It took me 6 months. Finally realized that I was mad in love with this woman back in North Carolina. Went back there. Worked at Research Triangle Institute for several years, and then went up and got a PhD in healthcare informatics at the University of Minnesota. I was a sociologist studying organization theory about how these systems sort of change the shape of organizations and the way that they function. Wound up from there becoming the head of healthcare IT consulting for Arthur D. Little, which is a consulting firm. Was spending a lot of time on the road, and my wife said, "You want another kid? You got to get off the road." So I became the CIO at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, which is, Steve, where we met. And when the Brigham and Women's and Mass General came together, I became the CIO of the sort of combined entity. So between the Brigham and Partners Healthcare, was the CIO for 22 years. Spent a year at the federal government working with Dr. David Blumenthal to put the meaningful use regulations together, back when that money was sort of flowing. And then went off to run the healthcare IT business for Siemens for 5 years. We were bought by Cerner, and then became the senior vice president of population health at Cerner. And then at the end of 2019, I quote, retired. It's a lowercase r. And so do board work and a lot of writing and do some teaching. And that's the position of executive in residence at the Harvard Medical School. So, 40 odd years, a little over 40 years in this field, Steve. And you're not as old as I am, but certainly seen a lot of changes.
Absolutely. And the reason why we're talking today is about those changes. In 2022, I think all the things that we dreamed about back in my fellowship days about things we want to do, things we'd like to do, things we would absolutely love to see happen, all of a sudden became possible with the advent, or at least the introduction of large language models into the scene. And mind you, we all know that really wasn't the beginning of AI. AI has been out there for literally for decades, but it took a hockey stick launch when it became AI for the rest of us. So I'd like to sort of discuss today your perspectives on AI. You've seen things over the last 40 years and how they've changed and how they've gone. And, the name of the podcast is Practical AI in Healthcare, and we're looking for, trajectories of what is the most practical point of view here. In our pre-work with you before we recorded this, you had mentioned a model that you discussed with us around various percentages and how things have evolved over time. You want to unpack that a little bit for the audience?
Yeah, fair enough, Steve. Well, I mean, one of the things I've observed in my forever tenure is about every 10 years, the technology arrives, information technology that fundamentally alters the world. So in the 60s, it was the mainframe, the 70s, the mini computer, 80s was the network personal computer, 90 was the web. I mean, Google was founded in 98. 2000 was the mobile device. The iPhone debuted in 2007. And now we're at this era where AI has made us sing. And each time we were able to do things we couldn't do before. So, the mini computer enabled a modern HIT business. Epic, Cerner, Meditech all started with the mini computer. So anyway, all of these is sort of broken barrier, enabled us to do things that we couldn't do before. And one of the questions is, well, why AI? Why now? Well, it's a bunch of things. Clearly, there's been advances in methods, the large language model methods and a series of sort of transformational, approaches to this. But it's also the compute power has just become an amazing amount of power for not a whole lot of money, frankly. There's also business model where people say, I can figure out a way to make money, so I'm going to invest. And to create companies and basic technology business models have emerged. And plus, there's a whole lot of data. So there's a series of forces which came together over the last several years to really enable AI and not only large language models, but models that enable us to read images, the predictive models, and things along those lines. So I think we're now at the point we're still really, really early in the sort of understanding how best to apply this, and obviously it will continue to advance. So we're beginning to really see ways that it can help. One thing to point out is when you have these technologies, they are really takes years, decades sometimes to really see it play out. It took years for the internet to really become a basis for a lot of business and the social media and things along those lines. So we got to just settle in. We're in for a long journey, a journey that will continue to evolve, and we're at the very early stages. So anyway, I'll stop there. See if that caused any questions or just created mass confusion.
Hardly confusion because I think you're echoing what my observations have been in the space. The fact that it's had such incredible hype, and unlike other novel technologies that have hit the space, it feels to me like it's aside from the hype, there is a lot there. There's a lot of meat there that is actually somewhat different than I think other hype cycles that we've lived through. The types of things that AI is now able to do, especially in the healthcare domain, um, is it's staggering, frankly.
I think, and history will tell, kind of its magnitude relative to other digital innovations and its magnitude relative to other innovations such as, electrification, or the internal combustion engine or flight, things along these, all of which have had, massive impacts. I remember reading about a story of some fishermen off the coast of Somalia who used their mobile device, having got their catch, to find out the best market for their catch up and down East Africa. Wow. And so you have data now which suggests that 80% plus of all adults globally, you think about that, globally have a mobile device. So the world is different in very fundamental, diverse ways because of that. So I think all of these have been phenomenal. What we'll see in AI, and part of it is some of it's here now. I mean, you've got cars that are smart. You've got buildings that are smart. You can have a chat bot with someone who actually sounds like a therapist, and both, the empathy and the knowledge, et cetera. There's a lot of stuff here. And we're beginning to see it in what I call the administrative side, prior authorization, utilization management, things along those lines. And we're still, other than the radiology, we're still trying to figure our way out to help, clinicians like you, make better decisions or augment their decisions. So it's clearly quite powerful. I think it's too early to know how powerful it is. And I think one of the things you have to remember is that technology moves at a speed that is much, much faster than the ability of the society to adopt it and to integrate it into its work practices and new businesses and all that other stuff. So those take years to go off, even if the technology is moving much, much faster. So you can see this sort of excitement about the technology, yeah, but where's the beat? Where is it really playing through at this point?
And that's actually what Leon and I, so I think you know that Leon and I are both involved with something called the DCI network up at Harvard. And we're running a conference that's starting tomorrow, in fact, on this very topic on, we're looking, where's the beef? The conference's subtitle is actually, what does good look like? And what does it look like today, 2+ years into the world of AI? Let me hand it to Leon for a few minutes here and have him ask a few questions. Leon?
Oh, and thank you so much, John. Such a delight to talk with you. I think your broad perspective on clinical informatics and information technology is just a wonderful thing to bring to this conversation about a highly hyped area. I wanted to ask you to share with us what you've learned from that very interesting paper that you guys recently published. The you've made a really important observation in that paper, and that in many cases using domain specific models works better in healthcare IT than in healthcare AI than the domain general super overpowered models. Um, I, I think our audience would love to hear what led you to that conclusion. What use case did you start with? And how did you discover that the general models are not a particularly good fit?
Yeah, and I think, Leon, this is, and we'll get into the specifics of the paper, but this is an example of the learning going on here. There is a lot of hype, which is basically means we don't have a lot of practical experience yet. And so you'll fill the void with hype to the degree that there's not a whole lot of people doing a whole lot of real getting their hands dirty type work and learning the hard way. An example of this is that, people are discovering that, using the, AI to listen to the encounter between a patient and their clinicians, and generating a note actually in some cases creates more work. Because in some cases, as a physician, there's some clinical and educational value to making me write it down. What was I really thinking about rather than having it sort of showed up? So we're learning about upsides and downsides of all this stuff. And the only way to do that is to get in there and to really start this stuff and to be humble and pilot in ways that, you're not going to hurt anybody that messes up. So back to the specifics of the paper, in general, and this was some work done with a colleague, Amber Nigam, who is the CEO of a company that does prior authorization. And basically, their model is, prior authorization is when, the physician says, I'd like to run an MRI of Steve Labkoff's back because he's had a lot of back pain, et cetera. We've tried this and we've tried that. And I need, because of the insurance coverage, to get the authorization of the plan in order to do that. And so sends this off and it waits and this and the other. Nobody likes this process. It's a pain in the butt. It takes forever. Patients don't like it. Doctors don't like it. Frankly, health plans don't like it. So they're using this logic to say, can you, given gleaning data from the electronic health record and other observation by the doc, can you basically have the AI say, this thing just slam dunk. Why are we even bothering an authorization? This is very clear that this is the right thing to do. And everybody says, no need to go any further. Or the machine comes back and says, what are you, crazy? This is really dumb. There's no way this is going to get approved. And so you actually can take out about 80% of the prior authorization decisions by the machine and say and have focus on the ones that are ambiguous or have some debate here. So that's what they do. That's what their software is, and they're trying to relieve this burden that exists within this industry. And one of the things they started with was the general model. It's a large language model. And basically, if you had to imagine it, it's like that model is a sort of smart analyst. And you might say to the smart analyst, I'm thinking of going on a vacation to France. Tell me all the great things to see in France. Or tell me all that we know about a competitor or a customer or whatever is going on here. And this person brings together all this data, synthesizes it, and presents it. And it's really quite powerful, quite useful. Problem is that large language models don't always know the difference between good data and bad data. There's a lot of crap out in the internet. I mean, some of it's just malicious, some of it's just information, etc. So it is, you have to discern this. Now you put that in sort of this generalist. So there's a generalist that goes out and pulls all this stuff together, bright generalist, pulls together an amazing range of stuff, can lead to some pretty darn interesting connections, etc. And Steve, I remember talking to a colleague of mine, and you probably had this when you were in medical school or residency, is that he was talking about how he and his buddies, residents, would sit in front of the chief and present a complex case. And the chief would go, well, ignore this set of data. Pay attention to this set of data. By the way, did you ask about this? Let's run a couple more tests. And this person was amazing, this amazing cognitive exercise. And there you are as a resident in awe. How in the world did you arrive at this? And you realize you were in the hands of a specialist who had a series of experiences, who had some intuition, who had some judgment, who had all kinds of mysterious things that enabled them to sort of cut through and really see what was going on. And so one of the things that occurred to this prior authorization is that you needed context. You needed as well as you could to infuse expertise, judgment, and experience with this because the generalist was going to give you false information or insufficient information, whereas you wanted it to be much more focused. And you say, well, how would you do that? Well, you could train it on data prior authorizations because you can actually look at it more narrowly defined things. You could actually introduce the contracts, the managed care contracts into this thing. It says the contract says A, B, and C, and then D, and follow it that way. You could introduce clinical pathways. The right way to treat someone as a poorly managed diabetic is the following. So there's a class of large language models in which expertise, you have to put an expert overlay on this thing. And it's not just in medicine. It could be the legal professions. It can be in an engineering professions. It can be financial planning, anything where you say there's really deep expertise required. There are ways to do that to make sure you get a better decision, but also to make sure you don't wind up with decisions that sound right, but are not close to being right. And that's an example of learning. That's just, learning as we walk our way through this.
So, John, that's a fantastic insight. And by the way, the paper, which I should have mentioned where it was and what it's called, but it's in the Harvard Business Review called "Should Your Business Use Generalist or Specialized AI Model?" with Amber Nigam. One of the colorful metaphors that struck me in the paper that you used to explain why specialist models should perform better is something you've mentioned, which is that a generalized model knows everything, so it doesn't know what's important. And by the way, I came across this concept, believe it or not, in Mark Twain's Life in Mississippi, which I'm rereading. He has this fabulous character who cannot forget anything, right? He has this prodigious memory. And Twain, being an astute observer of human nature, including cognition, says, prodigious memory of that sort is a great curse because the man doesn't know what's important, what's not. And this man could not tell the story for the life of him. He would just ramble on and talk about everything at once, right? So I really want to just tie, I just wanted to tie, your observation to something that was said 150 years ago, by another astute observer of human nature. I'm wondering if you can comment on how the shift to agentic models changes the perspective, right? In some ways, agents are often meant to be specialists, although they're not always. Do you think is that a architectural change transition that changes your perspective, or does it just help it along, or is it orthogonal?
Well, I think it's a continuation of our growing sophistication and understanding about how to apply it. So it's an evolution, So you can imagine one of another colleague I have had a small company that looked at preoperative testing. So you're going to go in and get surgery, and there's a series of tests you have to do, and a series of things that the clinical team needs to assess before you go into surgery. Now, generally, they would have you get on the phone with a nurse, and the nurse would walk through this, that, and the other, and you say, "Golly, there's a whole bunch of these things that are just automatic, man." There's let's go through with the surgery. The test results look good. This person is, doesn't have any complicating conditions, etc. Let's focus the nurse on the 10%, 20% that requires. So having an agent that's essentially scanning the data, say this is good to go, and we need to go no further than this kind of stuff here. Or agents, and this gets a little blurry around the edges that says, I want to reschedule my appointment. The agent comes back and says, well, how about the follow? That makes sense because of where you live and the type of person you like to see. You like to say male versus female, whatever might happen to be. So I think there's this notion of, AI, which is sort of self-contained awareness of the situation, and then makes a judgment and says, not only am I going to tell you what I think happened, I'm actually going to go ahead and pull the trigger, on a variety of these things here and put it in play. I'll let you know. But I think that's a classic example of the continuation of, the sort of increment. And, we get into this conversation about general intelligence, which that maybe we'll get there. Maybe it's a bridge too far, but the way you get there or anywhere is a series of steps. You take a step and assess, you take a step and assess, you take a step and assess. It's highly incremental movement over time. And each step teaches you about what works and what doesn't and what the next step might be. So I think agentic is another step in our progression towards, the sort of growing sophistication of technology, but also beginning to, people to say, golly, I can see how we'd apply this. One of the things we, do teach this course, I'm going to shut up in a second. And the basic idea in digital technology is here's what we want to get done. We're a health system and we want to improve our ability to manage people's chronic disease. Okay, given what we want to do, what's the technology that will help us? That will do this. And sometimes it's exotic, sometimes it's pedestrian, whatever. Every now and then you hold up a technology to say, this is pretty different. And it enables us to do things we hadn't really thought about doing before. And that's a lot of what is going on in AI. And an example I sometimes use is there you are, the people who created Uber. Say, by the way, we now have a mobile device on the person who's connected, very powerful machine who knows where the person is. Uh, Maybe we could leverage that ability to create a company that enables you to summon a ride service because they'll know where you are, they'll know where the driver is, and we can wrap this thing up. So we're in that area, Leon, and this is agentic as example. Where you hold it up to your light and try to cut through the crap and the hype. Does it enable us to do things that we either thought about doing but were just too hard or too complicated, or wow, there's basic insight here, and that's kind of the cool part of the equation is just to see could the world look like with some of this.
John, in listening to your answer, it spawned a thought, which is the concept of what's old is new again. And I was a child of the 60s, and I was a huge fan of the space program and NASA. And as I grew up, I learned about how NASA makes or in those days made decisions on the Apollo missions and later on the space shuttle, where they had multiple computers that would measure something. And eventually there was a judgment computer that would look at all those inputs from these other systems and make a final judgment. And it makes me wonder, when you're saying about how agentic is a stepping stone, I'm wondering about, more than one system providing its specific opinions, perhaps some systems adding some general opinions, but then having an overall umbrella system that would make a final judgment. And I know that there are systems like that exist today, but I'm wondering, as we move into this space, is that, what's old is new? I mean, is that really something we should be considering?
Well, I think, when you look at the gradation of how we might apply AI, and you can run the gamut from allows you to park without putting your hands on the steering wheel, a variety of things like that, all the way up to where it's really doing what this chief of medicine was doing, which is a really complex diagnostic call on what is going on here. You see, and I think it's interesting. I was moderating this panel a couple of months ago, in which the panel members were CEOs of large health systems. So this is Sharp, this is the University of Maryland, this was Dartmouth, et cetera. And it was interesting because their comment was, we're seeing AI, we're doing the sort of encounter sessions and having machine listen and generate the note. That's all really good. But we have yet to see substantive and dramatic changes in what might be occurring. There's no big breakthrough. This is holy smokes. And they're all terrifying. Frankly, of this big, beautiful bill, and they're going to get, they were in a little rough shape to begin with, but now they're really going to be in rough shape with the Medicaid cuts. And obviously, if you're academic, you may have your indirect rates, take a hammer here, et cetera. So, they're all looking for this type of thing. And what, will happen is we'll start progressively going up the stack of value. And I think the next layer is basically quasi-administrative clinical processing. This is prior authorization. This is utilization management. This is helping the population health nurse say, by the way, I got to pay attention to laptop and not Leon. He's, whatever. It's sort of using these things which have a clinical flavor and also, an administrative core. And frankly, if you did them, you'd save a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of health. So there's real value here. Sort of. Now, what are the characteristics of that? And I'll get to your point here. It's a long way to get to your point here. Is that one that you can get real ROI out of this stuff? There really is savings. People savings, time savings. It's real. The others are not all that regulated and unlikely to be. So you don't have to worry about creating a misstep. But the main thing, to get to your point, is that the consequences of a mistake are modest. So at the end of the day, if I have a discharge planning AI and it could have sent you home today, but it didn't, it waited for a day, okay, that's not efficient, but nobody's going to die or get terribly hurt. As soon as we start getting into where it's in more direct control or oversight of the clinical call or the monitoring of your function, now all of a sudden, if it's not working, we got a problem. Because we can hurt people in a bad way. There you might have overlays. I can't handle the risk of somebody getting hurt. I need a secondary system to check to make sure it's right, reasonable, et cetera, because there's the risk of a mistake is much, much more serious here. So I think, in the case of, NASA, you say, golly, the risk of mistake on a piece of equipment flying through with human beings on it, that's wrong. We got a real problem here, and hence the double checking that we're going. Similarly, a nuclear reactor probably has similar types of things. So I think we'll begin to see that where the risk of poor performance is viewed as being highly problematic.
So, one of the things you just mentioned in that response, how the CEOs aren't really seeing the big bang just yet.
Yeah.
And one of my observations is, I'm working in the life sciences, and in life sciences, there's been an awful lot of noise about AI. But one of my observations is that I just haven't seen the middle stack of managers and worker bees. They're not comfortable with it. They don't have the literacy yet, and
Correct.
the efforts being made to help them come up the curve to start attaining some of these big wins. They start, from my opinion at least, they start with literacy. They start with being able to understand what to believe, what not to believe, what to question. It's not just about prompt engineering. It's about understanding the nature of the system and what the systems can do. I'm wondering if you can comment on the literacy question.
Well, I think that's real, Steve. One of the courses I teach is what we call leading digital transformation in healthcare. What do we learn, from other industries? And one of the things we learn is and there's an HBR paper on sort of transformations at work that came out last year, is that, and they compared 10 years, so 10 years, last year, 2024 with 2014. And if you look at all digital transformation, this is not just AI, 12% in both time intervals were deemed to be successful. The ones that were train wrecks 10 years ago was 38%. It's down to 12% now. Most of the ones are, so we're not any more successful. 12% is 12%, but we fail less often. We go from 38 to 12% or 13%, but there's a whole bunch of middle, that's kind of disappointing. Now, what you find here, say, well, why is that? Why, because nobody sets out to have mediocre results. That's not, nobody ever just says, let's pony up a lot of money, put a lot of effort getting something that's kind of dismal and all this kind of stuff here. Is one of the things they do is they don't manage the change process very well. That's why you get middle results. And one of the key things of the change process is you bring the people who are the front line. It's not just the middle manager. Sometimes it's the registration clerk or the nurse at the bedside. You bring them along with that. Now, by and large, they're bright people. They want to do the right thing. There's not like they're, some are, going out of their way to stonewall you, and some of them aren't very bright, but most of them are really want to do the right thing here, et cetera. So, but they don't understand, and they're worried that they'll feel stupid. They're worried that they'll lose their job. There are all kinds of stuff here. So I think when I think of literacy, yes, you got to educate them, and it takes multiple things. One of which is you have the leadership say, this is where we're going to go, and here's why. And it's leadership that's trusted. It's leadership that communicates, continues to communicate, and is viewed as, those people have done the right thing here. The other is show me. If I'm doing utilization management, say, I've got a fancy new AI thing to help you do that. You say, okay, but can I see it? Can I touch it? Can I inspect it? And so that's where you actually bring in pilots and you let people see it up front. And you don't say, I'm not the farm yet. Okay. We've got to check it out. It's also one of the things that practices when the transformation works is they push the decision making as far down in the organization as possible. So they say, look, I'm up in HQ. I'm bright, but I ain't that bright. So I want you, the front line, to run this initiative. Okay. We'll help you, we'll guide you, et cetera, but it's your call. This is what we'd like to achieve. So you give them, so people don't feel like victims. They feel like they're in charge of this thing. And where you give them the ability to say, we know it's wrong and we know its value. So we're going to help do this kind of stuff. So I think the way literacy is not the word I'd use. It's to get real experience in a gradual fashion. It's about, all right, I saw it. And I could trust it because that clinic over there is using it. I went to talk, I had lunch with my buddy who works in that clinic, and we see what happened. Sometimes you can bring in people from other organizations have the same job. He said, these are people who work in medical records coding from, people down the street here. Let's bring them in here. So you give them exposure to them. You put them in charge so that they manage it. You give them exposure. You're upfront about let's evaluate it. And if we all agree that it's working, we'll go forward with this thing. But I'm not going to put you on a path where you have no control over the destination, et cetera. So anyway, I think there is a quote literacy issue, but it's more of I just need experience with this thing. It's like a new parent. I just need a little bit of experience. And a colleague says, listen, I've had kid number 4. It's okay if they cry. Okay. It's there. That kind of stuff to go through. So anyway, I think that's a real issue, Steve. And a lot of people, they sort of steamroller this stuff. They think they're too smart at the top when they're not. And as a result, people push back.
So, John, I love the empirical point that we are reducing the severity of failure, not increasing the probability of success. And I also really appreciate your insight that part of that may be the implementation process and how we go about it can change those numbers. I have a sort of a hypothesis. I'm going to air it, although it's half formed. That I think what you're observing may be a general property of a discovery process. That generally, when we are exploring new spaces, whether you're talking about scientific exploration or geographical, sending ships out across the uncharted seas, it's generally hard to increase the rate at which you discover new continents. A lot of ships go out and, just one of them finds America and everybody else kind of, maybe they find an island, but most of the time they sail around, they don't find anything, right? But what we can do is develop systems and institutions that reduce the risk of disaster. Insurance companies, joint stock companies, better navigation, right? They were all institutions that evolved to manage that proportion of dramatic failure and reduce its severity and its impact. Obviously, what I'm saying is limited. In the long term, we can increase rates of success, right? Once you have satellites, you can find new continents, right? Pretty easily. But in a short and medium term, I just suspect that's what innovation looks like. Feel free to disagree with me. This is sort of
I think you're right, Leon. I think we're getting better at golly, how many we've been implementing systems for decades. AI happens to be the latest incarnation, but shoot, we've been doing this for decades. Steve, you and I did this decades ago. So we ought to know how to do it by now. We ought to know how to run a project, to get the goals, all that kind of stuff. Training, make sure the workflow is all taken care of. So the likelihood that we're going to fail ought to be reduced because there's no excuse for failure on these kinds of things, unless you get, way over your head, you mismanage it, frankly, and that will happen from time to time. Now, the fact that we didn't fail doesn't mean we're going to be a rip-roaring success. And we still had issues where people, and we've talked about this, get all excited by the hype. I used to think when I was at Partners Healthcare, there's a thing called the advanced states of technical arousal. Where you go into the chief meeting, oh my God, the pupils are dilated, they're flushed, they're shaking because they just seen the Gorbal 5000. They just couldn't stand it. It's going to cure cancer, take the paint off your car, the whole thing. And that still happens, and, people get all dazzled and, and in a way that's great. We want them exciting, but on the way, come on, calm down, take a cold shower, would you? All right, do this kind of thing. So, and it's also because we're still learning about stuff. And frankly, you go to a conference and you guys have done this, you hear this, and how we did this, we did that, we're spectacular, we're this, that, and the other thing. Golly, everybody's great but me. I'm going to go off and get this great stuff. And frankly, they're pulling the wool over your eyes. So I think we have still to learn about how to be sober and thoughtful about how to really go from crossing the finish line, but disappointing, to crossing the finish line with a big victory on this kind of stuff. There's still work to be done to go out and do that.
Yeah. So I just love the pragmatic perspective. It's a really good fit. And given what you're seeing, and taking your perspective into account and the critical role of implementation in success and the domain specificity of the best models, what's your sense of where we should look for the continents? What are the most likely areas where we're going to find great use cases where the current state of AI is going to make a big impact in healthcare?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a combination of a series of factors, Leon, that would cause you to look. One is you say, all right, I'm going to be, and we're going to focus on health systems, from the life sciences guys, et cetera. But in the health system, you say they're going into a multi-year period of severe economic distress. All kinds of reasons about it. And exactly what the leadership team, administrative, clinical, and the board's going to want to know, which is how in the world do we keep the ship lean, but at the same time fulfill our mission, et cetera. So I think if you say, listen, I want to focus my AI efforts in all my efforts, digital and AI, on areas where I can actually save money and create efficiency, period. I'm all for quality of care. Don't get me wrong. I'm that and the other, but man, I really got to avoid an operating margin that's negative 5%, things like that. So I think areas, you say, well, where's that likely to be? And I think it's in the processes of administrative activity. One category, processes of administrative activity, prior authorization, utilization management, medical records flowing, all that kind of stuff, where you can actually save a lot of effort. And we'll see that. And people will start doing that at scale and say, wow, we really could take, a big chunk of people out. Let's be frank about this. A lot of this is taking labor out for this thing. So I think that will be the case. The other area that we'll tackle, if you say, listen, it's just it's too hard to get to see a clinician. You guys see this. You want an appointment with a dermatologist or a PCP, golly,
More months.
forever. forever
Yep.
away. That's not right. It's not right at a moral level, but it's also not right at an economic level. Say, listen, if I could see all these people, that's great. So I think we will increasingly get better at using the technology to complement the clinician and enable them to see, more patients per its capacity arguments, for example. So to the degree that I can take a cohort of, let's say I got a population health, I got 1,000 diabetics I'm worried about. I want to be able to triage them into one or three buckets. What you're doing fine. I'll touch base with you periodically, but don't bother. The other is, you may be a little wobbly here. Let me reach out to you here, et cetera, and sort of talk to you about this. And the third is, come on in. We need to do this. So what I want to do is use the AI to predict who I should be seeing and who I can sort of let go for a little while here. And that's my utilization of my scarce clinical capacity. So we'll get better at sort of triaging here. I work with a small company in the UK that does this for Parkinson's and dementia. And, some people should be seen right away. And some people, they've got Parkinson's, we're not going to fix it, but they're doing okay. Relative, they're managing their symptoms, this and the other. So we'll get better at the clinical capacity. Another colleague, mentioned, he said he thought that within 5 years, 3/4 of all primary care visits would be done by nurse practitioners. There's just not enough PCPs, primary care docs to involve in doing so. And the problem with that, and that's great, and because there's more of them, they're less expensive, et cetera, is what you see often with a nurse practitioner is that they will do referrals to specialists more often than the doctor will, because they feel like, I've hit my ceiling of my prowess and I don't want to make a mistake, so I'm going to send off. You say, well, that's great. I increased the ability to get an appointment, but I made it more expensive possibly, because, we didn't resolve it right there in the account. Maybe we can use AI to complement the nurse practitioner and reduce the number of times that someone has to go see a gastroenterologist or neurologist or cardiologist, etc. So we will target a couple of areas, mindful of the stress. Let's go with things where you can take real money off this stuff. Let's go into areas where you can actually manage the clinical capacity, possibly increase revenue and this and the other. And again, I don't mean to point it as a mercenary financial exercise, but there's going to be part that's a mercenary financial exercise. Let's be clear about that. That's just the reality of where they're going.
It feels like a lot of the hype is wrapped around what's sexy. And what I'm hearing you say is, maybe we'll get the sexy, but right now let's block and tackle and get the real work done, get the real dollars out of the system, and they may not be sexy use cases. And by the way, we're seeing that happen exactly. So the best use cases in pharma that are working that I've seen right now, the sexy ones are things like synthetic clinical trials that are done in silico using AI, agentic AI. But the ones that's actually working and saving some major money is, getting a submission package together for the FDA and making sure the documents are all there.
Yeah.
And that's not sexy, but boy, oh boy, does it save time, energy, and effort. And that translates. Yeah, that really translates.
And I think, the world needs sexy stuff, because it's how we learn. You try the sort of the in silico trial and you do it right, and it's okay. We learn about stuff, but it's pretty darn cool, and it helps energize people from time to time. That being said, and all of us who've been in front of a board or a senior leadership meeting where they're stressed out the wazoo, if you come through with some stuff that sounds too rocket sciencey, the questions will be, what kind of data do we have that shows that this can deliver the goods?
Right.
Okay, so let's get real here. Now, I'm all for piloting or trying this, that, and the other, but let's get real here. And particularly if I'm going to put money here and resources here, but not somewhere else, I got to de-risk my investment here, which means I got to feel pretty darn good that you're going to deliver the goods at the end of the day. It means the right people on it. We're clear what we're going to do, et cetera. They're bright people. They're mission driven. They want to do the right thing, but they're not time for a bunch of cosmic stuff that has a high risk of not doing anything. You can't afford it.
Yeah.
So, John, I'm going to try to bring us to a landing with a couple of hopefully thoughtful questions. One is I think you've done a phenomenal job of reminding us that whatever the hype around AI is, it is an information technology, and it is subject to the constraints and the experiences that we've learned over the last 50 years and even the last 500 years, if you go back to Gutenberg and his press, right? So there's a line there that's, I think, really informative. But I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit. Even I think everything we've said about sort of the bread and butter stuff being really useful, by the way, is in my mind. But let's step out and and take a broader and more speculative view. if we could think of AI as just another information technology, right? But you can also can think of it as a control technology or cybernetic technology. It's like the thermostat. Is is there a fundamental difference? Is this one of those cases where a sufficient difference in degree is also a difference in kind? If you were to say there is a factor that differentiates modern AI from previous IT approaches, what would that be?
It's fair, Leon. And what I find in each of these sort of last couple of generations, one of the things that's kind of interesting, it actually took the internet before you could see a material difference in organizational performance. All of a sudden, most organizations, whatever technology you have, pretty much behave the same close part and other things like it's separate with the internet. All of a sudden, you say, wow, there's some power here that previously we just didn't have to really transform. Each of these things has removed a particular barrier. So if you say, what has the web really done at the end of the day? One is made it trivial to reach globally. It just is trivial, to put something up and have global reach. The second, it makes it trivial to conduct a series of, you can be make a small maker of something in a little hut at Cambridge, Massachusetts, and have a global distribution of this. It's trivial to do that. You couldn't do that before. It's trivial to form communities. And part of the political problem we have is it's too easy to form these echo chambers of people who sort of, bounce the same hatred off of each other. So it's dropped certain barriers. It's easier to form communities. It's easier to have a global reach than it did before. You say, well, what's the mobile device fundamentally done? It says, well, it's put the power of the machine on the person all the time. That's different. All kinds of things you can imagine doing as a result of that. That the machine's not over there; it's on me all the time. They say now we have the ability to where the machine can take a lot of decision making and cultivation of facts and summarizing off the cognitive plate and put them out somewhere else. So it's dropped a very fundamental barrier. There's a fundamental barrier of distance. There's a fundamental barrier of location. There's a fundamental barrier of the ability to take certain cognitive tasks. There really is cognitive work, to summarize what's going on when you look at a competitor and put it into the hands of machine rather than a human being. And so
Mhm.
anytime I think you have something that is that fundamental, drop a fundamental barrier, the world's going to be different. Now, do you really know what ways? No, because it's too big. It's too, it's like, having, the ability to, vaccinate people, et cetera, or to have power into the home. It's just too big. So anyway, I think that's the difference of it. And it'll get bigger and
Yeah.
broader, but it's just really taken a huge part of what consumes our individual lives and societal lives and said, you can have a machine do that.
So I love that perspective, and I think you're highlighting the unknown, right? That the impact of change in a fundamental constraint can't really be predicted. They're too big. I like your phrasing. It's a little bit different from the way I've been thinking about it, which is we are increasing the breadth of cognitive functions that we're automating, and when those functions are broad enough, we can start thinking of the function as an agent, right? It becomes an entity like, and our intuitions and metaphors that apply to entities begin to apply to the process that we've automated. And and I can't figure out how that's going to make things different either. So I
Well,
really
no, that's
appreciate
fine.
you. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, in Leon, there's a guy that's a scientist at MIT named Tom Malone, who was in the Sloan School. And one of the things he pointed out, a big famous study here, is the initial wave of the automobile back in the 1900s. And it was fundamentally viewed as a capital labor substitution. You don't need a horse, you can drive a car. And so what's the value of this sort of capital labor substitution? He said what people could not see at that point was that it would lead to the creation of suburbs and it would lead to the modern vacation. You just couldn't see that. You had to get to this stage that says, now I can see this. And also, by the way, I need infrastructure. I need gas stations and roads and insurance and all this other stuff. So we have to be sanguine about the fact that we can only see so far, really. We could speculate forever and ever and ever, but we only see so far. You have to get through to a certain level. And they say, now I can begin to see the second order effects, the third order effects of this kind of stuff here. But until you do the swapping of the horse for the horseless carriage, where they call it the horseless carriage, it's kind of a capital labor substitution thing going on here. So I think we got to be humble. Didn't try things or have great discussions, etc. But let's get real. There's only so far you can see about how the world will change as a result of this.
John, thank you so much for letting me drag you into the land of speculation. And by the way, I love the idea that horse was labor rather than capital. I don't think that's the way the farmers would work. I think it's capital cap, but let's leave that alone. I'm
Fair enough. Fair
about
enough.
that one, right? Right. So, so I think we've covered a terrific amount of ground. We've gone from identifying some of the pragmatics of what we know about AI as IT to to acknowledging our lack of ability to predict how fundamental changes in underlying foundational technologies will propagate downstream, because we know from historical examples we've been lousy at that. So, but I appreciate you trying to goad you into doing that. I think you've done a wonderful job. Just want to thank you for a terrific discussion. We wish we had more time, but Steve is telling me we do not. So I'm going to just thank you and enjoyed talking to you so much. I'm going to hand it back over to Steve.
Yeah, and John, this has been wonderful. It brought me right back to the classroom back at the School of Public Health when I was taking your class back in 1993 or 94.
Oh, goodness sake.
And yeah, I know. Trust me, I know. But the perspective, what I'd hoped for and what we got out of this discussion was your perspectives. And you always have a way of bringing a novel and innovative perspective to what looks like a pretty complicated thing, and you distill it down to something that's actually manageable and understandable. And for that, that's what makes you a fantastic professor, and I'm sure a fantastic business leader. I've never had the chance to work for you in any of your roles, but I would love to do that at some point. Although you're out of the game at this point, and I'm almost out of the game. Look,
Hang it.
yeah, I'm got one more in me probably. But John, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us your perspectives. Any final comments? Anything you'd like to add at the one last sentence?
No, I think this is a remarkable time. This is remarkable technology, extraordinarily powerful, unbelievable. I do think, though, and the way you deal with this kind of stuff is one step at a time. I sort of, we're going to try this and see how that works. We'll try that and see how it works. And so you take bite-sized chunks that you get your hands around, and you get the leadership to fund it. It says, all right, we're not betting the farm on the thing, and we want to see how it works. We can see where it takes us. There you go. It's a highly incremental evolutionary process, but you get there. Just as rivers carved the Grand Canyon, sooner or later, we don't have that much, it won't take us that long, but you get the point here. So anyway, I look forward to, being along with the ride with all of you.
Well, John, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Practical AI in Healthcare. I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of the title. Everything, all these pearls that you've dropped have been absolutely practical. They have been so on point. They've validated many of the things that have been in my head for a while, and I'm sure the same goes for Leon. And we'll just say thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. And we will see.
Thank you, gentlemen. Go ahead, Stephen. Sorry.
We'll see everybody again next time on Practical AI in Healthcare. Thanks for listening. Thank you for joining us this week on Practical AI in Healthcare. If you're ready to go beyond buzzwords and hype and explore how AI is truly transforming healthcare, stay tuned for more conversations that get us to what works. Until next time, stay practical.